my book, The Soil Will Save Us, was published back in 2014. And there's probably not a day that goes by that I'm not grateful to have been able to write about this material. Although at first it seemed to many people that soil was a boring thing to write about. And I had more than a few friends wondering if I had gone down a strange wormhole, pun intended. But thankfully that's really changed. And I know for a fact that farmers, farmers and gardeners and scientists and doctors and urban planners and policymakers and other people around the world are thinking about soil and how it's a living ecosystem and how the health of that ecosystem has enormous implications for our planet, for our waters and for our air, for our food and our health and for our climate. In fact, for the last couple of years, at least 14 states have passed or are working on legislation to promote and reward soil health. And I must say that it's been a hugely bipartisan effort. All of this gives me hope that we humans can learn to live and work in harmony with nature and stop screwing up the planet. So I grew up in California at the edge of the Sacramento Valley. From our house, we could look out across the valley and take in that vast agricultural expanse. My grandparents were farmers. My father was involved with agriculture. He had an olive orchard with sheep wandering through, and rather delightfully, it turns out that grazing animals in orchards and vineyards is now one of the best practices among a new generation of agrarians. The animals take care of the weeding and the fertilization and wind up creating great habitat for beneficial insects, and the farmers can eliminate or cut way back on pesticides and herbicides as well as fertilizer. My father would be so pleased to find out that he was an example of enlightened agriculture. But much as my father knew about agriculture and as my parents knew about gardening, they didn't know anything about soil. And as interested as I always was in gardening and organic food, I didn't know anything about soil until about 10 years ago when the great Cleveland chef, Parker Bosley, told me that I should be writing about something called carbon farming. He was one of those pioneering chefs like Alice Waters who started bringing local food into his restaurant back in the 1980s. He had grown up on an Ohio farm and he knew that the food he served to his customers was only as good as the ecosystem that produced it. So he told me that carbon farming, also called regenerative agriculture or agroecology, or more simply the soil health movement, was the most important new trend in agriculture. So this is farming that actually builds the amount of carbon in the soil instead of depleting it as conventional industrial agriculture does. It's farming that makes land healthier and not sicker. It actually builds soil, whereas conventional farming loses 24 billion tons of soil every year. What I developed in the course of writing this book and continuing to write about this kind of stuff, and what I hope to share with you is this profound sense of wonder about the amazing things going on under our feet. I walk on the earth differently, knowing about the vastness of life down there. Scientists think that there are 300 sextillion stars in the sky, and that's a lot of stars. But down in the soil, there's a comparable density of microorganisms, an incredible billion, or maybe 2 times that, or 3 times that in a teaspoon of soil. So I'm guessing that there are far more than 300 sextillion microorganisms just under Portland, where I live. These microorganisms have been found more than 10 miles down, but they're especially active around roots. We can't see these microorganisms, but they are busily making a living down below our feet. And everything we have or want above ground depends on what they do down there. I also want to give you what I think is reasonable new hope about our environment. Working on this book and learning about the promise of soil allowed me to take heart. I never doubted the global warming science for a minute, but it was hard not to be overwhelmed by grief and terror because it was obvious that we as a people are not doing the things that will halt in a dramatic and timely fashion the buildup of CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. I didn't realize it when I started working on this book, but the early climate science projections failed to take into account something huge, and that's the soil. Most of us don't take the soil into account. We think of Earth, planet Earth, as air and water and land. And we mostly think of the land as this thin crust over a big hunk of dead rock hurtling through space. And even though I have a connection to soil that spans generations, I had no idea how alive it is. When I would hear or speak the phrase life in the soil, I mostly thought about earthworms and beetles and ants and other visible creatures. But they are the leviathans of the soil. They're the great blue whales and the giant squids and the great white sharks. It's what we can't see that makes the soil so incredibly alive. The tiniest life forms that have been there long before these other creatures evolved and are crucial to the way our planet functions as one great ecosystem. And we're crucial to this lush, beautiful world developing at all. This recognition of the soil microorganisms' importance is pretty new. And I think it's like the very new recognition of the microbial community in our own bodies. Our bodies have roughly as many bacterial cells as human cells. I think the latest count on the human microbiome, and that's the busy community of microbes on us and inside us, mostly in our guts, is over 100 trillion. We are a ship of microbes, one that was pretty much designed and built by the microbes themselves. Actually, the word that many scientists use to describe a human is holobiont, an ecosystem comprising a host and many other species. Almost all the living things that we see are holobionts, with a lot of the essential work being carried out by these invisible microbial partners. And it's not just that we have one vast microbiome in our guts, we have smaller ones all over our bodies, and they're all a little different from each other. The microbiome of the stuff living around our teeth is different from the one living in our hair follicles, but we probably need or have learned to coexist with all of them. Scientists now think that those microbes are crucial to our body's proper functioning, to our digestion and our immune system and our metabolism, and even to the way our brain works, and compare their importance to that of an organ like a kidney or a pancreas. Incredibly complex. And of course, we humans are just a tiny example of the complexity of nature. When we look out at a landscape, any landscape, we have to remember that there's a dazzling and necessary level of complexity everywhere. But our inclination as humans seems to be to simplify landscapes. What happens when we simplify our own inner landscape, when we take a lot of antibiotics, which kill off big swaths of our internal partners, or eat Cheetos or Pop-Tarts for weeks on end? We get sick. So we humans have been carrying out a massive and deadly simplification of landscapes ever since agriculture began, and now much of that land is sick. And just as we're understanding now that we have to respect the complexity of our partnership with these microorganisms in us and on us, more and more people are understanding that we have to respect and support the complexity of our landscapes. The only way we can live on this earth without destroying it is to learn how to live in harmony with that complexity, to protect it and support the relationships among living things that comprise nature. And soil is full of those relationships. Healthy soil has a vigorous population of constantly interacting microorganisms like fungi. You may know that a mushroom is just the fruit borne by the fungal organism underground, which sends its silky strands 250 feet and even farther through the soil, where they pierce the roots of plants and string them into a community. And there are also bacteria, protozoa, microarthropods, nematodes, and other tiny creatures in the soil. Scientists have known that they were there for a while, but it's not until fairly recently that they understood why they were there and what kind of role they play. And what keeps emerging from this work is this incredible partnership, an ancient, indispensable partnership between plants and these soil microorganisms. This partnership created the green growing world that modern humans evolved in around 276,000 years ago. These microorganisms have been in the soil for around 2 billion years. And when plants began moving from the water to the land about 500 million years ago, they tapped into an already existing system for cycling nutrients and water. So what are the terms of this partnership? We know about photosynthesis. This is the great biological marvel of our planet, begun by bacteria around 2.4 billion years ago, and what is often called the Great Oxygenation Event, which changed our atmosphere into the one we have now. This was the first time living creatures changed the balance of gases in our atmosphere. Photosynthesis photosynthesis is now carried on by both plants and bacteria, and both create oxygen. But when plants conduct photosynthesis, they perform another function that's critical for keeping this world we inherited in balance. They use the energy from sunlight to pull carbon dioxide out of our atmosphere, and they convert that carbon dioxide into a carbon-based fuel, which they use to grow their flowers and fruit. When we eat these plants, we are feasting on carbon that came from the atmosphere. It used to be floating around in the air. Now it's in the sweet potatoes or the pomegranates or the flesh of the animals that eat the plants. But, and here's the partnership, plants don't use all of that fuel for their own growth. Around 40%, and sometimes much more, is sent down to the roots, where plants strategically feed the fungi and other soil microorganisms this carbon fuel, which is truly the elixir of life. In exchange, the soil microorganisms bring plants the minerals that they've liberated with enzymes from rock, sand, silt, and clay. Fungi bring more than just mineral nutrients too. They knit plant roots together and share water and chemical defenses and chemical messages like, hey, there's an insect attack within a plant community. For the book I'm working on now, I've spent time with a researcher in British Columbia who studies forests, and she found that trees of different species shuttle carbon back and forth to each other throughout the growing season through this fungal network, depending on each other's needs. She says that every time we take a step in the forest, there are 300 miles of tiny fungal strands underneath our feet, underneath a foot. This is really foundational partnership in nature. There are other partnerships in nature that we know about because we can see them easily with the naked eye. Like pollination, animals like birds and bees fertilize some 80% of Earth's flowering plants in exchange for nectar and pollen. We've been watching that with fascination for thousands of years. But up until fairly recently, we didn't have the technology to observe the partnership between these soil microorganisms and plants. It was tempting to look at a plant sticking out of the soil and think, oh, here's this one living thing. But now we're starting to understand that when we see a plant, we're looking at the most visible part of a very complex ecosystem. And that if our vision could penetrate through the soil, we'd see like a Boston or a Beijing or a Rio de Janeiro of microscopic life very busily at work around and inside that plant. There are 92 naturally occurring elements on our planet, and it's probable that plants need most or all of them to grow, not just the handful of nutrients we give them in chemical fertilizers. And the way they've always gotten them is through that partnership with fungi and bacteria and their interaction with other tiny things living in the soil. So when we walk in the woods or in a meadow that humans haven't interfered with or haven't interfered with much or lately, and we see this mad profusion of plants growing there, we don't ever think, well, who fertilized this place? But we probably don't realize that they are being fertilized by the microorganisms in the soil. So that's how the plant's partnership with soil microorganisms naturally fertilizes the plants. This partnership is also the main way that carbon builds up in the soil. The microorganisms eat that carbon fuel that they've received from the plants, and then they excrete it, and other microorganisms eat them and excrete it. It's basically poop upon poop, and then they die. And that carbon that came from the plant's roots, which came originally from the atmosphere, keeps getting more and more concentrated and tucked away in the soil. And here's another way that carbon gets concentrated in the soil. It's not just all poop and death. Fungi and other soil microorganisms make a kind of carbon glue to build tiny structures in the soil to protect themselves and to control the flow of water and gases. They engineer the soil and wind up creating what I like to think of as stacks and stacks of cups and saucers, billions of them. Or another way to think about this good soil is that it's like a coral reef underground. That's what we're walking over. Something that's that porous. We talk about standing on solid earth, but a better image to keep in mind is something that is more like a giant sponge. So healthy soil is very porous. And because of that structure, it can receive and hold water in a way that unhealthy soil can't. That's important because we all worry about rain. We worry either about how little we've got or how much we get, way too much. And that's the weather weirdness associated with climate change, too much rain and also too little rain. Healthy soil handles both of these problems. For every 1% increase in soil organic matter, which builds up through that partnership between plants and microorganisms, an acre of soil can hold an extra 25,000 gallons of water. So if the rains don't come, the soil is still holding water from the last time it rained. And if 8 inches of rain fall in a few hours, the soil can absorb it and it doesn't all run off into the streams. The problem is almost everything we humans have done to the land ever since agriculture developed has disrupted that ancient partnership between plants and soil microorganisms. It's not just a problem with modern industrial agriculture, although that is the most destructive way to simplify landscapes that we've ever come up with. Here's how the changes happened and continue to happen. Aeons ago, before the agriculture we now call conventional, we domesticated wild herds and changed the way they move over the land, and that began to damage soils. We dug up the earth and plowed to plant our seeds, and that plowing destroys soil structure. Something like this photo became something like this over the centuries. We eliminate the great diversity of plants from the landscape to make way for the one crop that we want to grow, and this is called a monoculture. And that lack of diversity above ground starves the microbial diversity below ground. And we keep the soil bare around that one crop. By using chemical fertilizers, we disrupt the feeding relationship between plants and soil microorganisms, that partnership that I was talking about before, in which plants exchange their carbon sugars with soil microorganisms for minerals and other services. We keep using more and more fertilizer, and then the environmental devastation is huge. Here's the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico caused by fertilizer runoff. And we use killing chemicals, the herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, and more, and thereby reduce the above ground biodiversity, which then affects the below ground biodiversity and threatens biodiversity in the surrounding landscape too. All these things disrupt the ancient partnership between plants and soil microorganisms and unhinge ecosystems. When we started doing some of these things 12,000 years ago when agriculture began, we also started liberating carbon from the soil and sending it off to the sky. That was how humans first began altering the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, long before we were burning fossil fuels. Scientists estimate that 133 billion tons of carbon have been lost from the world's soils. Today, land use related to agriculture accounts for about 30% of the carbon and other greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. All that carbon that's in our atmosphere is called the legacy load. The climate change conversation that goes on in this country and around the world erroneously focuses on the 2 parts per million of carbon dioxide that human activity keeps adding to the atmosphere every year. We talk on and on about reducing that, which of course is essential. But this conversation doesn't pay enough attention to the nearly 410 parts per million that are already there, that legacy load. What if we managed to stop all emissions today? That legacy load of CO2 in the atmosphere would continue warming the planet. We have to focus on removing it from the atmosphere. And the best way to remove carbon from the atmosphere, the cheapest, oh, I should have moved that out there sooner. The cheapest and most widely available technology, the technology that's been at work for a very long time without glitches and without unintended consequences, the multi-purpose technology that also increases fertility and decreases water and air pollution and does so many other good things is the technology that nature invented millions of years ago. Photosynthesis, which removes carbon from the air, and that partnership among plants and soil microorganisms that fixes some of that carbon underground. So how much carbon can be fixed or sequestered in the soil? The research is ongoing, but my favorite scientist working on this is molecular microbiologist David Johnson from New Mexico State University. He and his wife, Hui-Chun Su, developed a new way of making compost that's very rich in fungus. And he says that with very simple techniques, basically no-till agriculture coupled with cover crops, which are crops that are either planted on fallow ground to protect the soil, and even between the rows of the market crop to improve the soil and provide habitat for beneficial insects. and an inoculation of good compost, we can create farming ecosystems that draw down and sequester as much as 11 tons of soil carbon per hectare. He says that if his approach were used on agricultural lands around the globe, the entire world's annual carbon input could be stored in just 22% of the globe's arable land. Our biggest impact on the landscape is through agriculture. There are 4.5 billion acres of cropland around the world and 14 billion acres of pastures and rangelands. And because of bad farming, the soil in most of our croplands and rangelands is sick. Thank God, not all of it as sick as this. But according to Ohio State soil scientist Ratan Lal, 1/4 of the Earth's landmass is degraded and very sick from human activity. But we can look at that really shocking number, 1/4 of the Earth's landmass degraded, and think of it as an opportunity. We know that using a combination of using simple agricultural methods on that land and stopping the damaging ones, we can revegetate, heal soil, and draw down massive amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That degraded land that's been stripped of its carbon is a prime target. So is anyone doing this? Yes. That's what the soil health movement is about. It's going on around the world. Not that all the soil health farmers are doing it because of global warming. Some of them don't believe that human activity causes climate change, but they're doing it to make their land more resilient, to grow better food, to stop erosion, to save water, to spend less money on chemicals and equipment. And because healthy soil saves us in so many ways. Sorry, I squeaked. My computer was doing the wrong thing. The movement for soil health is all about mimicking nature in ways that enhance and protect that ancient partnership between plants, animals, and soil microorganisms. I talked to scientists when I first started working on my book, the soil book, about their research in this area, but many of them were quick to tell me that it was innovative farmers who were really doing the most important work. I was introduced to one of these innovative farmers by a young guy working for the National Wildlife Federation who told me that Gabe Brown in North Dakota was the most amazing farmer that he's come across. So Gabe became the centerpiece farmer for my book, and now he has his own book for anyone who wants operating instructions from the master. So Gabe has a 5,000 acre farm outside Bismarck, North Dakota, where he gets about 16.5 inches of rain per year. He began to dramatically change his farming about 25 years ago. So he began as a conventional farmer with tilling, chemical fertilizers, and other agricultural chemicals, as well as GMOs. And he still produces some commodity corn and wheat, although he's diversified a lot since I first met him. He is not like the guys at my local farmers market. And I think that's really important. He didn't get into this because he was idealistic and had a romantic or altruistic notion about farming, but because he liked farming. I mean, because he wanted to make a good living. So, and I think that's important because people like him have to be able to make a good living at this to want to make a change. He stopped tilling because he noticed the soil was drier when he tilled. And then he had this epic 4 years of crop disasters. One year there was drought, one year there was hail, another year there was another drought, another year there was a late frost, 4 years where he couldn't take a crop to market. And he couldn't afford any of the chemicals he'd been applying. So he had his cattle harvest what was left of the crops because that was the cheapest way to clean up the ruined fields, and it fed his animals. And he started to plant cover crops in the fall to protect his soil. And in a few years, he found that his soil was changing. It was becoming richer and darker and holding more moisture and becoming more resilient. Through a partnership with a scientist and a conservation educator from the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, Gabe Brown started to figure out if nature would do all the things he needed to be a successful farmer instead of his using chemicals and tillage. So he tried to mimic the way nature grows plants. He began to understand that his soil had become more resilient because he wasn't disrupting those microscopic soil communities through tilling. He wasn't destroying those cups and saucers and thereby destroying his land's ability to hold water. And he realized that his cover crops were keeping that underground community of microorganisms healthy by feeding them carbon fuel through their roots 8 or 9 months out of the year. So he increased his use of cover crops. He now uses what are called cover crop cocktails, mixes of around 25 to 70 different plants to feed a diversity of carbon fuels to those soil microorganisms. So again, what he's trying to do is mimic nature. So a square foot of native prairie near where he farms can have 140 different plant species. So plant diversity is important for that underground population and for supporting a diverse population of insects. And he realizes that his cattle can have a healthy impact on the land if they're managed properly. They're dropping their dung, which is loaded with microbes, and they're peeing, and that's full of nitrogen. And they're stomping down plants so that they turn into the kind of mulch that microorganisms eat. And so he increased the number of cattle and rotates them through his land, taking care that they're there long enough to have that beneficial impact, but not so long that they eat the grasses down to the soil line and stop photosynthesis. But he always talks about managing 2 herds on his property, the cattle and the herds of microorganisms underground. Of the 2, he says the soil microorganisms are the most important. He always tries to manage the land for their needs. And now at this point, Gabe Brown uses no fertilizer, no pesticides, no fungicide, hardly any herbicide, none of those other agricultural chemicals. To prepare a new field for his crops, he'll plant a cover crop cocktail and then clear it up with his cattle. He may do this a couple of times. So what are the results? Last time I talked to him, and it's probably a lot better now, he had 27 more bushels of corn per acre than the county average. He spends $1.25 to produce a bushel versus $3.50 for the county average. The organic matter in his soil has gone from and this is back in 2012, 1.7% to 5.3%, and his son wants it to go to 12%. And in a time where we worry about water, too much or too little, this is another remarkable change on the Browns farm. In 20 years, they went from water infiltrating 1/2 inch in an hour to infiltrating 15 inches in an hour. So the soils are so porous, so many of those cups and saucers that I was talking about, that the soil sucks up that first inch in 9 seconds and the second inch in 16 seconds. So altogether 2 inches in 25 seconds. Gabe and his son Paul don't irrigate, and they say they don't worry about drought. Their land is like a sponge that holds all that water that falls until it's needed. Because it doesn't matter how much rain there is if the soil won't hold water. When rain falls on compacted, degraded soil, it just runs off and takes soil and any contaminants like agricultural chemicals into the streams and rivers. So I think this is a really hopeful and exciting time. Gabe Brown is just one example of someone very consciously supporting the partnership between plants and soil microorganisms, really trying to work with the many partnerships and relationships in nature and thriving as a business person because of it. And there are thousands of other farmers on the regenerative path. The message that we can take from their work is that we don't have to accept the false dichotomy that we can have good food or enough food, good agriculture or productive agriculture, healthy landscapes or healthy profits. They are showing that we can have good food, good agriculture, healthy landscapes, and farmers who can make a living. I talked fairly recently to this organic farmer in South Carolina, Nat Bradford, who grows watermelons, collard greens, and okra. And he's also doing great soil work. Unlike Gabe Brown, he did go into farming with a mission. And the funny thing is, he was discouraged from it by a high school ag teacher who said, no, don't go into farming unless you already have 2,000 acres of land and 2 million in farm equipment, you'll never make a living. So he went into landscape architecture instead. So his idea was to design healthy urban landscapes instead of ones like the one right across the street from my house in Portland, because he had heard that 25% of all chemical pesticides are used in city landscaping, in people's backyards and in schools. So he set out to design landscapes that didn't have big, bare, mulched areas that are most easily maintained by herbicides. Basically, he was doing what the regenerative farmers are doing, using cover crops. He finally ignored his high school teacher's advice and got into agriculture, and he's been a tremendous success. He uses no chemicals on his farm and lots of cover crops. And he's even figured out a combination of cover crops that grow, mature, set seed, and die in time for him to plant his cash crops into that ground. So you know how people often say that organic farming is fine for the elites who can afford to pay a premium, but ignores the needs of ordinary people who can't afford the higher prices. But by working with nature, Nat is harvesting, in the case of okra, he's harvesting 22,000 pounds of okra per acre. And that is 4 times the amount that conventional farmers in his area who are using chemicals are getting. So with those results, he can beat them on flavor, quality, landscape health, and price. So let's put that argument to rest. We can figure out how to have healthy landscapes and productive agriculture. So we live in really challenging times. Of course, I don't need to tell you that. But I think we have to remember that even in the bleakest circumstances, there is the possibility of regeneration. So a young scientist I talked to in British Columbia is working on a project to reforest land ruined by a mine disaster. And she's planting new little trees out on that ruined land, each with a handful of soil from the forest, from the nearby forest. That handful of soil contains what scientists call ecosystem memories, fungal spores, bacteria, seeds, other bits of DNA that can return the land to health. I love that idea of ecosystem memory, and I'm pretty sure that even in the bleakest places and the most degraded landscapes, those memories of life and the capacity for health and wholeness exist if we learn to treat the soil and all of nature as a partner, not a spoiler. And in the long tradition of people who have looked to nature as metaphor, I firmly believe that if we can nurture and heal the land around us, we will nurture and heal ourselves in the process. So thank you. And if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them.
Awesome. Well, round of applause from everybody for Kristen. Thank you for that. Let me get my, yeah. That was wonderful. Wow. What a whirlwind tour and very inspirational. Thank you for delivering that. And we did get some questions along the way. Incredible presentation. Thank you so much. Start off with that comment, but let's see what questions. Let's see. Susan wants to know, how does the microbiome survive being covered with asphalt and or concrete? Maybe an obvious question. Or how well does it fare? I don't know.
Well, you know, scientists have looked in all the most hellish landscapes on Earth, you know, from very hot deep sea vents to all sorts of places, and they have found microbes living in those landscapes. I mean, obviously, being covered with asphalt is pretty terrible for the things that live in the soil there. But as Paul Engelmeyer said to me when we were out on one of his tours, he said something like, nature wants to heal so badly. And I think that, you know, when we unpave those areas, when we peel back some of the terrible damage that we've done and work on revegetating and allowing nature to come back in, that we can, you know, bring back those microbiomes. I mean, of course, we never can bring back, this is why we have to stop paving things. We never bring things back to their original condition. Nothing ever is quite the same, but we can bring health back to even the most poorly damaged lands, I think.
Yeah, I think here at the Watershed Council doing a lot of environmental restoration, ecological restoration work. We're certainly of that opinion as well.
Yeah.
Evan, did you want to?
Sure. Yeah, I think Margot asked this when you were talking about carbon storage. Margot, if I misinterpret this, if you want to clarify in the chat box, she just asked or just questioned 11 tons per hectare per year. I think that was about carbon storage. Is that
I
the
think
right
it was,
figure?
yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Is that's all you're looking for, Margot? Is just confirmation of that? Does that seem right? She's typing something. Yep, she got it. Perfect. Thank you. So just clarifying that. Another one from Margot was, what can be done about the politics of agricultural chemicals to encourage and spread, what you shared tonight?
Well, I think that, well, for one thing, I was just listening to a couple of young scientists, one of them at Oregon State University, a couple of young scientists about their research into what's called holistic grazing. It's people who are moving their animals over the land the way Gabe Brown is. But anyway, one of these scientists was just talking about being at a huge meeting with all these big companies like Cargill and huge players, and they were all talking about soil health. Now, I think people like us tend to not trust any of those big companies when they talk about soil health because or other things, because we know that they really are only always trying to find a new market or some way to squeeze into this new thing that we all want. But there are all sorts of big companies that are trying to improve their supply chain because investors and consumers want that. And there are more and more farmers, I think, all over the place who are finding out, unfortunately, most of the university ag departments are dominated by the sort of the corporate farming has dominated the teachings and the narratives in those departments. However, because of things like YouTube and Zoom and online conferences, more and more farmers are being won over to changing the way that they work because of the things that I said in my talk about that they want their land to be more resilient. They want their soil to absorb water. They would like to cut back on chemicals. So some of the changes are happening at a grassroots level. I mean, I go to farming conferences and I get really excited to see all the young people who are getting into farming and the older people who are changing. So there's a lot of change happening at a grassroots level, but there's also changes happening at a bigger level. I mean, we really have to work on changing the farm bill because that will push a lot, so that our tax dollars reward farmers for doing the right kind of farming instead of rewarding farmers for doing the wrong kind of farming, which is basically what it does now. But I do see a lot of change happening in many ways. It needs to happen faster.
Great, yeah, and like you were saying earlier in your talk, just spreading the word and dispelling the myth about conventional farming being more lucrative, and that this restorative agriculture actually is not only has all those environmental benefits, but can be more productive.
Right. Oh, I just had a great phone call just like last week with Ratan Lal, the soil scientist that I was talking about before. And he is the preeminent soil scientist in the world. And he was talking about, for a long time, there's been a lot of anxiety on the part of, I think, a lot of people, but a lot of anxiety about how, the world's population is growing. How are we going to feed all these people? You don't hear it as much anymore because the world population is, the projections about the world population growth are starting to change and come down. But, for a while, what you would hear was conventional agriculture eagerly rushing forward with their narrative saying, yes, to feed all these hungry people, we're going to need to, put the pedal to the metal and, you know, more chemicals and more GMOs and more of all that. And when I was talking to Ratan Lal last week, he was saying that what the research is pointing to is that, in fact, especially in countries where industrial agriculture hasn't really taken over, that they can increase their yields 2 and perhaps 3 times by using these ecological principles in farming. And he was so, he said that there are, anyway, I can't remember the number that he used, but he was saying that, you know, that we can actually start, if all these farmers start to employ these agricultural principles, we can actually use less land for agriculture and turn more land back over to nature, which is a really exciting thought.
Absolutely. So Mike Broyley says, it sounds like permaculture. Do you agree or feel like?
Well, it's certain, permaculture is certainly part of it. I mean, I think there are a lot of regenerative agriculture. It's, you know, the idea of having a plant, you know, plants that are on the land that you don't remove every year. You know, they're cousins. I'll say they're cousins. Organic, regenerative, permaculture. You know, I think that the focus of regenerative agriculture is not to disturb the soil and to feed the soil by having a lot of plants, roots going into the soil. And that certainly is consistent with what permaculture aims for.
Great. So Paul Engelmeyer actually asked, have you, you know, shared this or worked with local soil water conservation districts, or, you know, discussed this with anyone at USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, or Farm Bill folks?
Oh, well, the USDA has their whole soil conservation service. They had a whole soil health. They had a whole big soil health program. They still do. So they're working on that a lot. I mean, they're a little hamstrung because of the influence that those big companies have, but they have been working with farmers a lot on cutting back on tillage, using cover crops, doing all that stuff. And I've spoken to several soil and water conservation districts.
Excellent. So I like this next one from Kate. Love the book. In person, even better. What should I read / do next as a very small city yard owner? Thanks.
I'm sorry, what was the rest of the question?
What should I do? What should I read or do next as a small city yard owner?
You know, there are a lot of books out. Unfortunately, I can't think of the title right now. I mean, you should read Suzanne Simard's new book, The Mother Tree. Not that it'll address your concerns about your yard, but she's the scientist that I was with up in British Columbia who, you know, discovered this network of fungal threads that connect forests. And that's the book I would read next. I'll have to think about what one would be specifically about a garden. But, you know, in my own garden, I try to use the principles that the regenerative farmers are doing. You know, try not to disturb the soil, try not to dig it up a lot, try to have a lot of try to have a lot of plant biodiversity. And that plant biodiversity attracts insect biodiversity, which attracts bird biodiversity. It's the principles that they work by. Sometimes they don't create as much beauty as we would want in our gardens, but I try to observe those principles.
So Joanne asks, how does this information get to the farmers who need to reevaluate their practices?
Well, many farmers are reevaluating their practices, and really it's the farmer evangelists like Gabe Brown, who was in my book and now has a book of his own. He's reaching out, he reaches out to farmers. He goes and speaks to farmers all the time. So it's probably not the likes of me who will re-educate farmers, but it's some of these farmers that I write about who are re-educating farmers.
Yeah, good answer. Okay, so another one here is, what about tree farmers? Is there any trend towards private timber landowners changing from clear cut, pesticides, etc., or for ODF to favor those who use more regenerative practices?
I really couldn't answer that. I mean, that's why reading Suzanne Simard's book would be a good one, because it's about forest practices. She's a forest biologist, but I really couldn't say what ODF is doing. I don't know.
Fair enough.
So Mike asks, we're getting into books now, I think. Are you familiar with Wes Jackson's work?
Yes.
Okay. What is it? I'm not familiar with it.
Oh, Wes Jackson, Wes Jackson is a visionary who, he has a new book out. He is a visionary who started, I can't even remember how many years ago, 25, 30 years ago, maybe more, trying to work back from our major, take our major crops are now, they're all annuals, so they produce a lot. They don't put a lot of work into their roots. Some work, but they produce a lot, like corn, big heads of corn, big wheat, big rice. And that whole, that whole process of farmers having to replant every year. And I think when he started, the whole no-till movement wasn't as big as it is now. So, I think he probably would be pretty excited about the regenerative ag work that's being done. But anyway, he has been trying to breed perennial crops so that farmers don't have to replant, and, the farmers who still plow, that they don't have to plow, that they can just plant these perennial crops, and that would be less damaging to the land. But it's a very, very long process. As far as I know, his institute, the Land Institute, has only been able to come up with maybe one crop that is now being commercially used.
Interesting. Yeah, it all harkens back kind of to the one straw revolution. It's another one that I was throwing in this category. That was a great book. Similar topics. So I think we've got some comments coming in. John Jevons' work is good for small scale gardeners, uses the same principles. So there's maybe a helpful response to that earlier question. And Kate says, right now I have more than enough pine needles. And here's a question, and then I think we'll wrap up pretty soon. Are master gardener organizations embracing regenerative practices? Do you know anything about that?
I think it depends. Certainly some are, but it depends, they vary from place to place.
Victory tree gardens, Kate throws out.
Great.
I don't know what exactly to make of that one.
I don't either.
One last breaking question here. We'll cut it off after this one. Can you comment on glyphosate in soil? How long does it last, or pass through?
Oh, I wouldn't be able to say. I mean, I think glyphosate is completely evil, and we should move towards eradicating it as soon as possible. I was just reading something about how it kills microorganisms in the soil. But I couldn't say how long it lasts in the soil. I mean, they claim that it doesn't last long, that it, and it's something that's used, we can't just blame farmers for that. There are a lot of people who are, who work on clearing out invasive plants, and they feel that it's, that the cost of getting rid of those, that it's worth it to get rid of those invasive plants. And I think we all have to stop using it. It's a terrible chemical.
No, I think you'd find see a lot of head nodding going along with that answer. Well, maybe we call it good there, but I did want to just say that although I didn't have the chance to read every last word of it, this book, The Soil Will Save Us, is really awesome, not just for all the beautiful information, valuable information that's presented in it, but really fun read, well written, and
thank you.
Lots of good stories, and so still well worth picking up and reading, even if it's a few years since it's published. And so thank you so much for joining us and sharing all that with us and having that discussion.
Okay, thank you. Good to talk to all of you. Wish I were down there.
Yeah, maybe next time.
Bye-bye.
That next book.
Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. And like I said, we'll stick around for the board meeting. So feel free to jump off now and head out. We'll get our board meeting started here in a couple minutes. Thanks, everyone. Good to see you. I like the cameras on too. I'll vote for that. Wow. I saw at least 2 dogs during the presentation.